Every series needs a start, a beginning, a measuring stick, a place to. Okay, I'm babbling on. Sorry. Harry. Harry Lipsy to be exact here. And today we begin the adventure that will be Harry Chronicles Seinfeld. And so each week or each day or whatever I decide to do, I will take a look at an episode in chronological order of Seinfeld. Huge fan. To me, it's the greatest show ever made. Some people agree, some people don't. Today we will start with taking a look at the beginning of Seinfeld. And just like this podcast may be, the beginning of Seinfeld, the first episode, was way different than what it turned out to be. But there was a base of an idea. And that's what we're going to talk about here as I look at the Seinfeld Chronicles, which is the first episode of Seinfeld. And originally that was the idea, that was going to be called Chronicles of Seinfeld. And I actually thought it was an idea that probably should have stuck. I love that name. I think it's unique. I think it sets it apart. But I believe at that same time, there was a show on a different network that was using that Chronicles. I believe it was the Carter Chronicles, if I'm not mistaken. But so they wanted to separate themselves, and they decided to take the and Chronicles out and just call it Seinfeld. Which, is hard to argue with many decisions that the team behind Seinfeld made, because obviously it was a very successful show. So I'm not going to say it should have been the Seinfeld Chronicles, but I'm going to say it should have been the Seinfeld Chronicles. But taking a look at that first episode, again, much different episode than any others, because really it was the sets were completely different. And again, this was just a pilot. And it's funny, kind of doing some research, it sounded like this sitcom was dead in the water by the time that the pilot even aired, because the ratings had been so poor with test audiences. But they played the pilot. The reviewers, the critics seemed to like it. It got pretty decent Nielsen ratings, so they decided to continue to go through with it. So talking about the Seinfeld Chronicles, so basically it's centered around the characters of Jerry and George. Those were the main two characters. And it's interesting to see their characters are different in the Seinfeld Chronicles than really any other episode. To me, there's a scene where Jerry is describing his feelings for a girl that he had met in Michigan. And he describes it basically how most people would describe that. There was a connection, that he was attracted to her, but he thought there was a really good conversation. And it was actually a really good scene for most sitcoms. Now watching it, thinking, wow, this says nothing like any other episode of Seinfeld. Because usually, Jerry wasn't interested in a connection a lot of times. It was, with him at least, it was always about something else. So I found that interesting, that in this episode, Jerry's perspective is a little different than any other episode. And so he actually comes off as more of a regular person than the terrible person that he and the rest of the cast is in the rest of the show. But, and George is the same way. George has some of the kind of personalities that makes him a true Costanza. He's more of a real figure in this show as well, in this episode, where, you don't really get that feeling of self-loathing. He's confident, but it seems like in this first episode that he has something to be confident in. He's a pretty intelligent, pretty successful real estate, I'm not going to say mogul, but he's in the real estate game. You get a feeling he knows what he's talking about. You get a feeling that, things are going pretty well in his life. And who knows if that's true, but that's the feeling he gives off. And most of the rest of the series, you don't get that feeling from him. And to me, George is the best character in Seinfeld as the series goes on. And part of that reason is that I've never seen a character that is such a vile human being, but somehow you kind of root for, because he has this, he understands that he's a bad person. And so he knows he's neurotic and judgmental. And so there's something kind of touching about it, because to be honest, you're not going to say anything about Seinfeld's touching very often. So I will say that I like that that George is who he is. He knows who he is. He knows that he's not a very good employee. He's not a very good son. He's not a very good friend, and he's just fine with that. So I always found that kind of an interesting dynamic. So those are the two main characters in this in this episode. And a lot of it, especially beginning in the episode, is just them sitting down at a coffee shop talking about random things, which is, I think, where if there's any part of the first episode that really shows what Seinfeld's going to be about in 3 seasons, 4 seasons, 9 seasons down the road, it starts with those conversations. And that very first conversation was about where George's button was, and Seinfeld kind of went off on him. And obviously, which is funny because that's how the show ended. But that was the kind of conversation that really geared dialogue in later seasons of Seinfeld. So I thought there was some good dialogue. I thought there was, some fun banter. But this was a much simpler episode than anything they had done, they're trying to introduce you to the characters, so it's a much simpler episode than you're going to see in future seasons. The other character they kind of introduce is Kramer, but in this episode, in the Seinfeld Chronicles, he's known as Kessler. And it sounds like they had named the character Kessler because the character was based off of a guy named Kenny Kramer, a former roommate or a guy that lived in the apartment building of Larry David. And that's obviously who Kramer was based off of. But David was very leery about naming the character Kramer. So in the pilot episode in the Seinfeld Chronicles, he's known as Kessler. It's interesting. He has a little different personality in this episode, too. You just get a feeling like he's kind of quiet, kind of soft-spoken. Yeah, he has a couple kind of, physical pratfall kind of things. But, definitely kind of in a world all of his own. But in this episode, it seems like he's a little bit more soft-spoken. And also, they kind of play it off as if he's, never gotten out of his apartment in 30 years. Which, obviously, in the show and, later seasons, he's always out of the apartment. He's always doing something. He can't sit still for more than 10 seconds. So this character is played a little different. So we're just going to keep calling him Kessler. Because in Seinfeld Chronicles, Kessler is a completely different person than Kramer and Seinfeld. And then the fourth character is the waitress, and her name is Claire. Originally, it sounded like the plan was to have her part of the regular cast, and there's a couple conflicting reports of what happened. One was that she kind of said to Larry David, "Hey, I could write something better. Do you want some input?" And obviously, he didn't want input. The other thing was that the other story goes was that they were looking for a strong female character who was kind of in the same social circles, who was in, that was someone that they could hang out with after work. And they felt Elaine Bennis was a better character than Claire. And they're probably right. Obviously, it's tough to say that Elaine Bennis wasn't the right choice. I think Julia Louis-Dreyfus is amazing. I thought she made Elaine probably the most well-defined character in Seinfeld. But so that, Elaine is definitely missing in the Seinfeld Chronicles. I will say I thought Claire was maybe a character that would have been interesting to keep in future seasons. I thought she was an interesting character. I thought she maybe was someone that could show up once every 5 episodes and just keep the guys in their tracks. But didn't happen that way. I'm happy how things turned out, obviously, with Elaine. But it would have been interesting if there's one more female character that popped up every once in a while. And I thought there was some good banter. I really liked there was a scene where George was a little nervous that Claire didn't know if the coffee that she was serving was decaf or regular because it didn't have the orange sticker on it. And I think that's funny because the orange sticker obviously doesn't, I could put anything and say, hey, this is decaffeinated coffee. So I found that an interesting conversation. I really enjoyed the banter there. And, so that there were parts of the episode I really enjoyed. I thought there were some comedic situations. Again, the plot line was that Jerry had met this lady in Michigan and she was going to be in town. And a lot of it was a conversation between Jerry and George and then Jerry and Kessler about understanding women and understanding intentions. And later in the episode, it turns out that she was looking for a place to stay, basically as a hotel, a cheap hotel, a free hotel, I guess, because she was engaged. And that was kind of an interesting part of the episode. Again, a little more basic than most episodes. Not a lot of really building, but it was a decent story. There was some good dialogue. I think it was a decent start, and I can see why people tuned in, and I can see why critics enjoyed it. It was different for the time, and I thought it was overall not a bad episode. One thing that the Seinfeld Chronicle brought to the table was Jerry Seinfeld's stand-up comedy. I will say, I think he's a funny stand-up comedian in general. The stand-up on the show is terrible. Like, there are very, very, very few bits that, when they show the stand-up comedy on the show, that are actually funny. I mean, there's some observations, yes, but there's no jokes. They're not funny. I mean, and that's when people do imitations of Jerry Seinfeld as a comedian. I don't think a lot of them have actually seen him as a comedian. They've just seen him on the show, and they're like, I like grapes. I like fruit. Hate grapefruit. Can't stand it. What's the deal? Obviously, that was a really, really bad imitation of Jerry Seinfeld. But I find it interesting that he didn't choose to do a little bit better bits. I really think he had better stuff, and maybe he just wanted people to go check out his act. But I don't think the stand-up comedy bits on that show are reflective of the kind of comedian he is. Maybe he was playing a version of himself that just made really weird, obvious, observations most of the time. So, but that starts, that starts in the Seinfeld Chronicles, and it carries on over until, I believe, season 6 or 7, and then they did a different kind of opening where they actually did a lot of the material they were doing for those kind of stand-up bits, and then just kind of put them into the show somehow. But again, I didn't think the jokes were very funny to start the show, and I believe, put it at the beginning, the middle, and the end. But the thing, especially in these early seasons, is they always kind of fit. Especially if they're going to show them in the middle of the episode, they fit into the episode pretty well. It showed his point of view, his perspective. They weren't always the funniest thing in the world, but I get what he was trying to do. I do think it fit well into the show. I just wish it would have been funny. But so that's kind of a look at the very first episode of the Seinfeld Chronicles. Again, interesting because it's basically George and Jerry, So it would have been a different show if they were just the two primary characters, and Kessler showed up every once in a while, and Claire was there a little bit. I mean, I don't know, it wouldn't have been nearly the successful show it was. Not taking anything away from the characters of George or Jerry or Jason Alexander or Jerry Seinfeld. They're a lot of fun to watch, and this episode was fun to watch. But I think not having Julia Louis-Dreyfus or Michael Richards as regular cast members would have greatly, greatly, greatly lessened the impact of that show. So, it's interesting. And that's something we'll see episode 2. And, on the first episode, the scenery was way different. The set was way different. The coffee shop we never see again that I remember. We'll see. Maybe in episode 2 or 3. I haven't seen those for a while. So what I'm doing, guys, is I'm watching. I maybe take a couple notes, and then I'm going to talk about it. So there might be something I don't remember. I have seen every episode, at least 4 or 5 times, but who knows? There's always stuff that kind of slips by. So maybe that set shows up again. His apartment is also way different in the Seinfeld Chronicles than the other one, than in the rest of the seasons, But so it's different. But between the stand-up comedy, some of the observations, the banter between George and Jerry, you can see the shell of what Seinfeld will become. So it's fun to watch. So if you've never seen the Seinfeld Chronicles, the first episode, hey, I say give it a shot. Take a look. Again, it's fun to see what it started from and what it began. And I'm sure, maybe with this podcast, we'll see how bad I started, how bad this is right now, and hopefully I get better. Who knows? But sometimes I tend to get worse with age, like the opposite of wine, like ketchup. Ketchup's not good like 2 years down the road. So I'm like ketchup. I'm not like wine. I'm like ketchup. Then I just get worse and worse and worse and worse. There's a reason I'm not a stand-up comedian. Well, I really enjoyed this, guys. This was the first episode of Harry Chronicles Seinfeld. We will be looking at episode 2 during the next episode of our podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure to add comments or like it or dislike it or do whatever you need to do, but I'd love to hear feedback. I'm really enjoying this, and I'm looking forward to more episodes to come. So again, this is Harry Chronicles Seinfeld. I'm Harry Lipsey. Thank you so much for joining me.